I remember the gloves. That's where it all starts, really. Not the depot, not the crying, not even Jessie. It starts with me sitting on the edge of a bed in Virginia, pulling on white kid leather gloves one finger at a time, slow and careful, like I was dressing a wound. And I mean, I was... The fire had taken our house 3 years before. 1882, the driest October anyone could recall. I woke to smoke so thick I couldn't see my own hands. And I didn't run. Mama's letters were in the writing desk, every letter she'd ever written to Papa before the war, tied with blue ribbon, tucked in the bottom drawer. I reached into that burning desk and I pulled them out. The drawer handle was already hot enough to blister, and the wood cracked and spat, and my hands, well, my hands paid the price. I saved the letters. Every one. But the skin on both palms and across my fingers pulled tight and shiny afterward. Pink in some places, white in others. Like a map somebody had drawn wrong and tried to erase. Back in Richmond, my father's friends stopped calling. The invitations dried up like creek beds in August. My mother, God rest her, used to say that a woman's hands were her introduction to the world. Mine now told a story nobody wanted to read. I was 23 years old with scarred hands and a family name that didn't carry the weight it used to. And so I answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times, a Mr. Harlan Pruitt of Abilene, Kansas, seeking a well-bred wife of good character and pleasant appearance. Pleasant appearance. I should have read that line twice. The train ride took 4 days. 4 days of keeping my gloves on, even while sleeping. 4 days of practicing how to extend my hand without anyone noticing the texture beneath the leather. And then Valentine's Day, 1885, Abilene Depot. He was standing on the platform in a fine wool coat, hat in his hands, looking exactly like the photograph he'd sent. Tall, prosperous, the kind of man my mother would have approved of. I stepped off the train and smiled. He smiled back. He reached for my hand to help me down. And my glove, it caught on the rail, pulled right off, and there was my hand bare, scarred, reaching out to him in the cold February light. His face changed. The smile didn't fall so much as it emptied, like someone had blown out a candle behind his eyes. He looked at my hand the way you'd look at a bolt of cloth with a flaw running through the weave, something you'd push back across the counter. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. "I'm sorry, I don't believe this will suit." And he walked away, just walked away. I sat down on the depot bench. The train pulled out behind me, heading west without me on it. The platform emptied. February wind came through the boards cold and mean, carrying dust and the smell of cattle yards and nothing at all that reminded me of home. And I cried, not the pretty crying I'd been taught, the kind with a handkerchief pressed delicately to the corner of one eye. No, I cried like something inside me had finally cracked open, ugly and honest, my whole body shaking on that wooden bench. Through blurred eyes, I looked at the depot wall red brick, solid, mortared tight against weather and time, built to keep things out, built to stand no matter what battered against it. I understood walls. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the shadows to shift. Long enough for the cold to stop being something that touched my skin and start being something that settled in my bones, deep down where no coat could reach. Then boots on the platform, the creak of someone sitting down, not close, the far end of the bench, respectful like. I didn't look up. "Ma'am." The voice was quiet, not careful the way polite people are careful, like they're afraid they'll catch what you've got. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that understands sometimes a loud voice is the last thing a person needs. I don't mean to intrude, but, well, you look like you could use this. A handkerchief appeared in my line of vision, clean, white, folded into a neat square. I took it without thinking and pressed it to my face. It smelled like cedar and horse leather, warm smells, living smells, not like cologne or hair tonic or any of the things Harlan Pruitt had probably been wearing. I finally looked up. He was well. He wasn't much to look at, if I'm being honest. Thin, dusty, a coat that had been patched at least twice, boots worn so far down at the heels they barely qualified as boots, no silver on his belt, no watch chain, no indication that he owned anything in this world besides the tired horse tied to the post behind him. But his eyes brown, deep-set, steady, they rested on my face the way they might rest on a long view of open country, in no hurry to look elsewhere. "Bad day?" he asked. Simple as that. "You might say so." My voice came out rough, wrecked. The man I came to meet decided I wasn't suitable. His jaw tightened, just barely a small muscle by his ear, a flicker of something he chose not to say. "He see them hands of yours, not staring, just knowing." I flinched. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And listen. I will remember this until the day I die," he said. "Ma'am, any man who walks away from brave hands like yours ain't worth your tears." Brave. He called my scars brave. I searched his face for pity, the tilted head, the soft voice that really means you poor thing, but there was none. He was simply looking at me, the way nobody had looked at me since the fire. "Name's Jesse Tanner," he said. "I do seasonal work round here. Ain't got much, but my sister May runs a boarding house up on 2nd Street. Clean rooms, good coffee, hotel's full tonight on account of the Valentine's dance." "I have money for a hotel," I said. Defensive, already rebuilding. "I reckon you do, ma'am." He stood, tipped his hat a real tip, not the performative kind, and started toward his horse. "But May's got a warm kitchen and she don't ask no questions. Just in case you decide you'd rather have warm than fancy." He walked away, didn't look back, didn't press, just left the door open and let me decide whether to walk through it. I watched him go, patched coat, worn boots, a man with nothing in his pockets, yet he'd given away his only clean handkerchief to a crying stranger without hesitation. I pressed it to my face one more time, cedar and leather. I stood up and followed the direction he'd walked. I woke the first morning at May's not knowing where I was. The ceiling was wrong low, whitewashed, with a crack running east to west like a river on a map, not my Virginia ceiling with its plaster rosettes, not the hotel room I'd imagined waking in as Mrs. Pruitt. Just a small, clean room that smelled like someone else's coffee and bread that had been baking since before dawn. I lay there for a long time, listening. Footsteps below, the clatter of dishes. A woman's voice, May's telling someone the biscuits weren't going to wait for stragglers. And underneath it all, the Kansas wind pressing against the window like it wanted to come in and introduce itself. May Tanner's boarding house was warm, chaos, mismatched furniture. A cat sleeping on a chair that didn't match the table. Curtains washed so many times they'd gone from blue to something closer to memory. May herself was a sturdy woman with Jesse's same brown eyes and a handshake that could crack walnuts. She'd looked at my hands when we shook the night before, and I'd braced myself. "You got a good grip," she'd said. That was all. "Most folks who show up at my door got a story." May told me that first morning, setting coffee down hard enough to rattle the saucer. "I don't need to hear it less you need to tell it." I meant to stay one night, maybe two. But then May asked me to help with her correspondence, a stack of letters she'd been meaning to answer, her handwriting looking like a chicken had walked through ink. I sat at her kitchen table and wrote replies, and one of the boarders, A young woman named Della, who worked at the laundry, watched me with wide eyes. "You write so pretty," Della said. "I've been meaning to send a letter to my sister back in Missouri, but I can't write so good. Would you like me to help?" We sat together, and I wrote what Della spoke about the Kansas wind and missing home and how the sunsets here were bigger than anything back east. When we finished, Della held that letter like it was made of gold, and she cried a little, and she said, "I ain't been able to talk to my sister in 2 years." Something turned over in my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long time, the feeling of being useful. Not decorative, not suitable, useful. Jessie came and went around the edges of the boarding house like weather fixing a hinge, stacking wood, nodding when our paths crossed but never hovering. Once, I caught him watching me write, not my face, my hands, and the look in his eyes wasn't pity. That night, I unpacked my trunk, hung my dresses in the wardrobe, tucked Pruitt's advertisement in the nightstand drawer. Outside my window, the garden wall stood bare in the last February light, stone and mortar, waiting. Spring came slow to Abilene, not the dramatic Virginia kind with dogwood blossoms and sudden warmth, but a stubborn, quiet greening, grass pushing through hard dirt, buds on the cottonwood trees that seemed to say, "We'll bloom when we're good and ready." I'd been at Mays for 6 weeks, still telling myself it was temporary. By then I was teaching 3 boarders to read and write Della, a widow named Ruth, and a young bride named Abigail who could barely sign her own name. We met at the kitchen table after supper, and I never planned it. 1 woman needed help, then 2, then 3, and for the first time since the fire, all those years of tutors and books and penmanship meant something beyond decoration. One evening, Jessie appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had his hat in one hand, and with the other he was absently running his thumb along the brim the way he did when he was working up to something. "Miss Ashby, I got a question. If you ain't too busy." He sat across from me and pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket. "Needed to write to a rancher in Dodge City about spring work." "I can read fine," he said, "but my writing comes out looking like a drunk spider across the page." I laughed. A real laugh, not the polite Virginia kind. And then I felt guilty about it, which was, honestly, that was foolish. But there it was. We worked on the letter together. He spoke slowly, choosing words the way he did everything with care. His story came out between the sentences. Orphaned at 12, raised by May, worked cattle since he could sit a horse, never had money, never stole, never lied. "That ain't exactly a recommendation for prosperity," he said, almost apologetic. "It's a recommendation for character, which, in my recent experience, is considerably rarer." He looked at me and smiled, small, quiet, like sunrise through a crack in a barn wall. Then Della knocked on the doorframe, looking embarrassed. "Sorry to interrupt, but Jessie, my window latch is stuck again." He was up before she finished the sentence. Didn't sigh, didn't make a show of it, just stood and followed her out. I watched through the kitchen door as he passed May's youngest boarder in the hallway, a girl of 16, limping slightly on a turned ankle and without breaking stride, without a word. He moved the heavy water bucket from her path to the wall so she wouldn't have to step around it. He didn't know I was watching. That was the thing. He wasn't performing kindness. He was just kind. The way water is wet, the way Kansas is flat. It was simply what he was. My hands were bare on the table when he came back. The scars caught the lamplight, pink and white and plain as day. He glanced at them the way you'd look at a map of somewhere worth going with interest. With the quiet assumption that the journey would matter, I didn't pull them away. He reached for the finished letter just as I slid it across, and our fingers almost touched over the inkwell. Almost. In the warm kitchen light. With coffee smell still hanging in the air, I pulled back, but slowly, so much slower than I would have a month ago. The thunderstorm hit on a Tuesday in late April, the kind of Kansas storm that doesn't announce itself but just arrives. Like a freight train with no schedule, 1 minute the sky was grey, the next it was black. And rain came down so hard it sounded like the whole world was being hammered flat. Jesse and I were in the barn, him with the horses, me gathering eggs from May's stubborn hens. When the sky opened, there was no running back. We just stayed. He lit the lantern and hung it on a nail. The light swung with the wind, throwing gold across rough wood, and the horses shifted and breathed in their stalls. And the rain, God, the rain was so loud we had to lean closer to hear each other. For a while, we didn't talk, just sat on hay bales and listened to the storm like it was a conversation happening without us. Then Jessie said, quiet-like, "Can I ask you something? Miss Ashby about the fire." My stomach tightened. "What about it? I don't mean the scars." He said it quick, like he'd been thinking about how to say it. "I mean, what did you save?" I stared at him. No one, not my father, not the doctors, not a single soul in 3 years had ever asked me that question. They asked about the burns, the pain, whether I could still play piano, but no one had asked what I'd reached into a burning desk for. "My mother's letters," I whispered. "Every letter she wrote to my father before the war, tied with blue ribbon. The drawer handle was... It was already too hot to touch. But I couldn't leave them. I couldn't let her words burn." "So you saved words," Jessie said. "I saved words and lost the hands that were supposed to be pretty." The lantern swung. Rain hammered. A horse whuffed soft in the dark. "Seems to me," Jessie said, slow, careful, like he was setting down something fragile he didn't want to break. "You chose what mattered." That's when I broke. Not the depot kind of breaking, helpless and ashamed. This was deeper. This was the sound of a wall cracking from the inside, a wall I'd built so high I'd forgotten there was anything still living behind it. I cried, and he didn't touch me, didn't try to comfort me with words or promises or any of the things men offer when they don't know what else to do. He just stayed, sat on his hay bale with his hands on his knees, and let me come apart in front of him without once making me feel ashamed of the pieces. And somewhere in that storm between one crack of thunder and the next, I saw my scars differently. Just for a moment, not as damage, not as what I'd lost, but as the price of a choice I would make again. Every single time, I would reach into that desk every time. The rain softened, went from hammering to whispering to something almost gentle. Jessie stood and lifted the lantern from its nail, held it out to me. "Storm's passin'," he said. I took the lantern. Our fingers brushed his rough, mine scarred. Neither of us pulled away. I should have known he'd come back. Men like Harlan Pruitt don't accept inconvenience. They rearrange the world until it suits them. And when his replacement bride failed to arrive from St. Louis, well, he rearranged his standards. I was walking on Main Street on a Saturday morning, no gloves, carrying a basket of books for my students when he stepped out of the hotel like he'd been waiting. He looked expensive. That's the only word for it. New coat, polished boots, a gold watch chain catching the light. He carried wealth the way some men carry weapons visibly, deliberately. "Miss Ashby," he tipped his hat. That smile again, the one with nothing behind it. "I'd heard you were still in town." "Mr. Pruitt," my voice came out steadier than I felt. "I've been doing some thinking," he said, and I could tell he'd rehearsed every word. "And I believe I was hasty in my initial assessment." His eyes dropped to my hands just for a second, a flicker of something he smoothed away fast. "You're clearly a woman of education and refinement. I believe we could still come to a mutually beneficial arrangement." Mutually beneficial. like I was a land deal. And here's the thing, here's what I'm ashamed to admit, even now, part of me wanted to say yes, not because I wanted Harlan Pruitt, but because, look, I was raised in a house with 12-foot ceilings and silver on the table and a mother who told me every night that a woman's worth was reflected in the life she was invited into. That voice, my mother's voice, my aunt's voices, every woman who'd ever loved me and taught me wrong, that voice was loud. It whispered, "This is what you came for, Caroline. Comfort, a name, a house with a proper kitchen and hands that stay hidden in fine leather and nobody asking questions." I could see it. I could see the dining room and the clean white curtains and the life where my scars would be a private inconvenience, tucked away like silver in a drawer. The town was watching. I felt eyes from the mercantile, the boardwalk, the livery, and there across the street, Jesse, leading a horse out of the livery, dust on his coat, nothing in his pockets. He saw Pruitt. He saw me. He said nothing, didn't cross the street, didn't stake a claim or puff his chest or do any of the things men do when they think they own a piece of you. He just looked at me, steady, the same way he'd looked at me on the depot bench. Like whatever I chose, he'd respect it, even if it broke him. "I'll consider your offer," I told Pruitt, and I walked away, heart hammering, hands shaking against the book basket. That evening, May sat across from me at the kitchen table, coffee going cold between us, and said plain as prairie sky, "That man sees a secretary, Caroline, someone to manage his house and look pretty enough from a distance. Jesse sees a woman." I went upstairs and opened the nightstand drawer. Pruitt's advertisement on one side, Jesse's handkerchief on the other, newsprint and cedar, two futures lying side by side. I couldn't sleep. Midnight. And the boarding house was quiet, just old wood settling and the wind doing what Kansas wind always does, which is never stop. I lay in bed turning Pruitt's offer over and over like a stone I couldn't put down. I got up, went to the wardrobe, took out my gloves. The leather was cool and smooth. I'd forgotten how smooth. I pulled them on, one finger at a time, and felt the kid skin slide over scar tissue, pressing it flat, sealing it away. My hands looked whole. They looked like hands that had never reached into anything burning. They looked like the hands of a woman who had never had to choose between safety and what mattered. I stood in front of the mirror. There she was, the Virginia woman, presentable, polished, every rough edge smoothed away. But her eyes, my eyes, they looked like windows in an empty house. Lit from somewhere, but nobody home. I pulled the gloves off, slowly, and there were my hands scarred, mapped honest. I held them up in the moonlight and turned them over. And I thought about Jesse sitting in the barn rain saying, "Seems to me you chose what mattered." And I thought about Pruitt's dining room with its white tablecloths and silver coffee service. And I'm not going to pretend I wasn't terrified. I was, because Pruitt was offering safety, the kind I'd been raised to want, where someone else builds the walls and you just live inside them, quiet and hidden and grateful. And Jesse wasn't offering anything except himself, which was everything, and which was nothing you could put in a bank or wear on your finger or show to the women back in Richmond as proof you'd landed on your feet. What if I wasn't enough without the performance? What if Jesse woke up one morning and looked at my hands and saw what Pruitt saw? What if I built something real and honest and it burned? Things burn. I knew that better than most. I walked downstairs and out the back door to May's garden. The wall stood there in the dark stone and mortar, cold under my bare palms when I pressed my hands against it. Solid, unyielding, like every barrier I'd built between myself and a world that kept telling me I wasn't enough. I could leave. I could put these gloves on and go back to Virginia and marry someone respectable and keep my hands hidden for the rest of my life and be comfortable and safe and dead. dead behind the eyes, like that woman in the mirror. Or I could stay, barehanded, terrified, alive. I went inside. I placed the gloves on the windowsill, fingers pointing outward, like hands waving goodbye to someone I used to be. I didn't sleep. But sometime before dawn, lying in the grey light, watching those empty gloves on the sill, I decided, morning, clean, sharp, Kansas morning, the kind where the light comes in honest and hard and doesn't apologize for what it shows you. I dressed carefully, not for Pruitt, for myself, for the woman I was about to become. I left the gloves on the windowsill, walked downstairs through May's kitchen. She looked at my bare hands and nodded once, slow, like she'd been waiting for this particular morning, and out onto Main Street. Pruitt was in the hotel dining room, white tablecloth, silver coffee service, everything polished and proper. The dining room was half full merchants, cattlemen's wives, the doctor's clerk. He stood when I entered, pulled out my chair, the perfect gentleman. I sat down, and then deliberately, slowly, with every sound in that room pressing against my ears, I placed my hands on the white tablecloth, palms up, scars catching the morning light that came through the tall windows. Every burn, every ridge, every mark the fire had written. The room went quiet. Not all at once, it happened in pieces. A fork set down, a conversation trailing off, a woman at the next table turning her head, and then silence, the kind of silence that has weight. Pruitt stared at my hands. His jaw worked. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup, knuckles going white, and I watched him try to arrange his face into something that wasn't revulsion and fail just slightly, just enough. "Mr. Pruitt," I said, and my voice was steady, the steadiest it had been since I stepped off that train. "I appreciate your offer, truly, but I didn't come west to be displayed. I came to be real. Miss Ashby, I hardly think I'm going to open a correspondence school for women who can't write their own letters, who can't sign their own names on their own land deeds." I turned my palms over and placed them flat on the tablecloth, firm, deliberate, the way you'd place a hand on a Bible to swear an oath. "I'm going to teach them with these hands." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. And honestly, maybe I had. Maybe losing your mind is just what it feels like when you finally find it. "I wish you well," I said. I stood up. I walked out of that dining room with my hands at my sides, uncovered, unhidden. And the morning air hit my face, and it tasted like the first breath after being underwater. I walked to the land office on 2nd Street. The clerk was a thin man with spectacles who didn't look at my hands twice. I took out the money I'd been saving for a train ticket back to Virginia, every last dollar of my family inheritance, and I signed the lease for a small building with a good window and room for desks. The pen scratched loud in the quiet office. My scarred fingers gripped it steady. No safety net, no return ticket, no gloves. I found Jesse at the livery, brushing down a horse. He looked up, and I think he saw something different in my face because he set the brush down slow and gave me his full attention. "I'm staying," I said. "Not because you asked, because I finally asked myself what I wanted." I held out my hand, my scarred, bare, brave hand. He took it. His palm was rough and warm and calloused from work that never made him rich and never made him bitter. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said quietly. I squeezed his hand. "I was hoping I would too." We stood like that in the livery doorway, in full view of the street, in the morning light that didn't forgive anything and didn't need to. I'm telling you this story from the desk of the Abilene Women's Correspondence School, which is, well, it's a small room with a good window and bookshelves that Jessie built from cottonwood and a sign I painted myself. Barehanded, in blue letters that aren't quite straight but are mine. It's October now. The The cottonwoods have gone gold, and the Kansas wind carries turned earth and dry grass and something that might be winter coming. I don't mind winter anymore. I watched May plant roses against her garden wall in April, pushing bare roots into frozen ground that had no business growing anything. And now those roses are taller than the wall itself, thorns and blooms and stubborn life, climbing stone like it was always meant to be there. 7 women come to my school. Della was the first. She writes her own letters to Missouri now. And last week she finished one without any help at all and held it up with a look on her face. I mean, you would have thought she'd struck gold. Ruth reads the Bible for herself. Abigail signed her own name on a land deed last month, her hand shaking, tears running, her husband standing behind her looking proud enough to burst. Small things, maybe. The world wouldn't call them miracles. But I've learnt that miracles don't always arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they come with a pencil and a piece of paper and a woman's hand, trembling a little, writing her own name for the first time. Jesse works steady at the Bar T Ranch, saving toward our homestead. He comes by the school in the evenings, and we sit on the front step and watch the light change over Abilene. He tells me about the cattle and the weather and the foreman's bad jokes, and I tell him about my students. And we talk the way people talk when they've stopped performing for each other. Honest, unhurried, real. He's building our house on weekends. Small place, east of town, porch facing the sunrise. When he asked me what I wanted most, I said a desk by a window. He didn't ask why. Built it first. I still have his handkerchief. It lives in the top drawer of my school desk. Folded the same way he folded it that February afternoon at the depot. The cedar smell has faded some, but it's still there if you press your face close. I take it out sometimes, not because I need to cry, but because I need to remember that there was a moment when everything had fallen apart, when I was sitting on a cold bench with nothing left to offer, and a man with nothing in his pockets gave me the only clean thing he owned and called my scars brave. I look at my hands now writing at this desk, morning light falling warm across the page, coffee steam rising from the cup Jesse left before he rode out, and I don't see damage. I don't see what I lost. I see hands that reached into a fire to save my mother's words, hands that wrote letters for women who couldn't write their own, hands that signed a lease and built a school and reached for a good man in the broad light of day. Jesse built our homestead with steady hands. I built our school with scarred ones. Together we proved that love doesn't begin with perfection. It begins when someone sees your scars and calls them brave. The fire took my old life, but these hands, these brave, burned. Beautiful hands, they built a new one. 2 coffee cups on a rough-hewn table, morning light through an open window, a woman writing, bare-handed, in a room full of words, I am home.